Who's read the book Moneyball? Read the book. Okay. Who's watched the movie? Okay. More people watched the movie, obviously. So in the book, in about page 14, it talked about the fact that winning associated more with economic success. So it features, if you don't know, a story of the Oakland A's in the early 2000s and how they used analytics to identify those who were going to contribute more than others disproportionately. And so fast forward, the CEO of Gap Inc. Reads that book, and then the CEO of Howard Schultz of Starbucks read the book. And so I, at Gap, got this mandate, Al, find on-base percentage for our retail stores. I'm like, are you kidding me? You know the difference between baseball, this closed system, and what we're doing, in retail stores, albeit, relatively closed? And the same charge was put forth at Starbucks, and we collaborated, and that was, in effect, the start of my career in this discipline. We've advanced a long way, so I'm really interested to hear what our panelists have to say. So if you would, Dafna, you start introducing yourself. Do you have a microphone, or I'll go get the other one?
Okay. Hello, I'm Dafna Aaronson, and I work with professional teams and collegiate teams, corporate organizations, primarily in scouting, player development, and how to really maximize potential consistently and get people working at their maximum effort.
Hi, I'm Emily Mcinerney, and I, as announced earlier, I'm a former Australian representative for basketball. Thank you. And I'm currently actually working in HR, and I do people data reports, and so I'm pretty excited to be here, even though it's in the capacity of talking about how data probably helped my performance when I was a basketballer. So.
My name is Paddy Steinfort. I'm the official title is Director of Performance and Leadership Development for the 76ers. In reality, I'm a mental performance coach. I'm also a mental performance coordinator for the Boston Red Sox, and a former professional football player back in Australia. Thank you.
But with that, Emily, I'm going to start with you because we had a discussion last night actually a couple nights ago, about how you were nudged, or I don't know the proper word that you used, coached to look at data in your own life to help you be a better athlete. Can you share a little bit about
Absolutely. So I can tell you the scenario. I'm very competitive, and I was ambitious as a child, and I always wanted to play basketball for Australia. And when I hit 20, I was yet to make the squad, the national squad. And I had a friend who was a sports scientist or a physiologist, and he said, look, I'm happy to take a scientific approach and we can really try and improve your fitness and get you up really competitive so that the coaches can't, or the selectors can't ignore you. And I, of course, took that on. He was very scientific based about how he trained me. I trained out in a lab with VO2 max gear and lactate tests and all that kind of stuff. So he was pushing me to my limits, and he said, before we do this, I need you to take a diary. So every morning I had to take my basal heart rate. I had to take notes of how I slept, how many hours, what the quality of sleep was. In the day I had to take, how many hours of training, the intensity of that training, what type of training it was, my nutrition, whether it was poor, very good, or good, and general well-being, like how I was feeling out of 10. Just have data on a page, and I did that every day. And it took a long time. I mean, these days you could probably use apps or Fitbits and things like that, but we're going back a number of years, and I had to do all that manually. From his perspective, he was wanting to track my basal heart rate and general well-being to make sure that he wasn't overtraining me, because obviously you can get diminishing returns on investment if you're training really hard but you're actually overtraining. But after about 3 or 4 months, I was looking back on when the days that I felt really, really good and performed quite well, I was able to sort of see some trends about what I was doing in the lead up to those days. And my reflection, it could be proven wrong. It's not, exact science, but I would train really hard and then have 2 lighter days, and then that 3rd day would be when I feel really good. So from my perspective, if I had a big game, like a final or something, that's how I kind of approached my training week in the lead up to, just because in my own head, my psyche was that was when I was going to perform really well. So that whole process of maintaining a diary was really helpful. And as I say, if I was an athlete these days, you've got lots of data points that be automated, or as I had to kind of it feels like, about 7 out of 10, or, manually take my heart rate. So not entirely accurate, but it did work for me.
Show of hands, who uses a personal development app, as Emily just described? Yeah, it's amazing because there's many of them out there, and I thought, frankly, the uptake would be much higher than it is, because our well-being is obviously paramount, but it's strange that we're not prioritizing ourselves. And there's this big wellness movement, right? There's a lot of wellness technologies, but they're now being provided by employers. Why aren't individuals actually going after owning that data themselves? So, Paddy, I'm going to toss it over to you, because obviously in basketball, there's a lot of analytics now. And you're looking at skills, people who can fit, within the team. But you mentioned you're a mindfulness coach. Are you, I imagine you are, but share a little bit about what you're looking for in terms of how someone might be a good fit for the team. What indicators are you looking for? And I don't want to seed it, but I know Carol Dweck's notion of growth mindset, the insatiable curiosity, willingness to learn, is something that I've heard is not commonplace, but popular to look for in athletics. But what do you specifically look for?
Yeah, I've been digging in. I'm likewise very excited to be in a community of people who do similar stuff, because I actually ended up, my first job here, I went to University of Pennsylvania, and I accidentally ended up with the Philadelphia Eagles, because I'd done some work in people analytics, psychometrics back in Australia with professional footballers. And as we built the model through the Eagles, and then I got a job in Major League Baseball with the Toronto Blue Jays, looked at, I think, 3 years worth of minor league players. So it ended up being an N of about 500. Not great, but enough. And there were 4 or 5 things that stood out, and they weren't necessarily the things that you might think. So it was kind of cool, but also changed a lot of what we did when we started looking, and also what we actually trained. So instead of doing positive thinking as a mental coach and, let's, try hard and talk to yourself, we ended up doing a lot more mindfulness, because being optimistic and positive was barely correlated with actually reaching your potential or exceeding it. Right. In sports. It may be different in business, but talking to yourself or thinking about how you're feeling while you're actually trying to do a really hard task, funnily enough, it doesn't help. You need to just be focused on the task. And so a couple of the things that stood out were grit. So Angela Duckworth's work was probably what brought me here in the first place, and that does positively correlate with the player reaching or exceeding their potential. Conscientiousness, which apparently applies to pretty much anything, if you're going to be good or better than. But the one that was surprising, that was not as much about growth mindset, although it probably produces a growth mindset, is competitiveness. And that's specifically measured. There's 3 subsets on that scale. One is competing to win. One is competing to achieve. So win as in the team. Competing to achieve as in I want people to know that I'm the best. And competing just for the sake of competing. Yeah. And that was the only one that predicted, but it was the strongest predictor by a long way of every psychometric that we had. And the thought was that produces a Tom Brady, Michael Jordan level of obsession with just, are you playing cards? I'm going to beat you. Are you shooting hoops? I'm going to beat you. Whatever it is, I'm going to do whatever I have to do. Growth mindset, I'll learn, I'll stick at it, but that's the driver of success in elite sports.
Interesting. Who here has, their organization has a mindfulness program or meditation rooms or things like that? I imagine everyone who raised their hand uses those regularly. No. So Gitanjali and I were talking earlier about this idea that if we take the historical approach and identify high performers in organizations, and they're busting their tail, they're working 70, 80 hours a week, and their relationships are suffering, their physical self is suffering, they might then be the models. Okay, if you want to be a high performer, we have to press reset on that model. So Dafna, to come over to you, there's a balance between performance, high contributor, and individual well-being. Can you speak to the work that you've done with Mets and elsewhere, and even in your own life, because I know that you practice this as well?
Sure. So to me, a lot of it has to do with the individual, the environment that they've grown up in, and the intrinsic motivation and the goals, right? So it's a combination of factors that allows one person to continue pushing themselves and not burn out, and other people to maybe do less or even the same and to burn out. I definitely, very similarly, also kept a journal, is very data-driven, but I became obsessive about it. It led to some injuries, and while I had experienced success, I would say I probably truncated my own success, and I'd say probably have unfinished business, but you learn to accept it and re-identify it as an athlete through this next phase of life.
AKA therapy. No, I'm just kidding. I'm speaking for my own self. Sorry, I was projecting. That was an example of projecting.
I think it's a lot of self-awareness. So the work that I do also looks at a lot of these traits, and to the points that Tomas and many people were making with machine learning. The platform that I use is machine learning based, so that you can identify 5-factor personality, including conscientiousness, problem solving, without bias. But then you insert the human qualitative element through a very specific interview. So you're getting them to tell you their story, and you're understanding what it's true of. So you can become more aware, and they can become more aware when they enter this new environment, if, when, and how they're going to be successful and avoid something like burnout. So when you do enter player development, and when you do start to use all of these awesome resources at your disposal, how it can best be suited for you, given your full context and your picture, not just the back of the card, and people have heard me say this, but also the front of the card. So it's a combination of factors, and it's being open to understanding how those things evolve and will continue to evolve.
And thank you for that. And just for everyone's context, why are we talking about this? So I kicked off today talking about humanizing work in this age of AI, and here we are anchoring the day talking about mindfulness and well-being and context of high performance. So it's not a key contribution. So when I'm listening to you, Dafna, I reflect that so many people, they go and they get a job offer from X company, Google or some prominent company, and they take it because they almost should take it, right? They think it's the right thing to do, but they might not know themselves very well. So what happens? It's not a good fit. And is it the organization's fault in that case? I hope for our kids that they know themselves well and they can be in a position to say no. So that's what I'm hearing you say, is that someone can understand their coherent narrative, why they're showing up at a certain point in time in their life, so they can put forth their authentic self. And should they work with that firm, let's say, that they can bring their whole selves to work. Is that a fair commentary on that?
Yes, and I would also say, we all started in sports because we loved it. We had a passion for it. So it's understanding that why, how it was derived, how you can continue to derive and receive joy from something that is now challenging you in a different way. Yeah. And sports is a really provocative way of saying, do I really still love this? And there's a lot of things, both internally and externally, that stress that. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what we do is to continue to help people understand where their passion is coming from, their joy for it, and how to really manifest that out externally.
I love it. Now, Emily, back to you, if I may just, you're generating reports right now on the people within your organization. Again, given our conversation the other night, I don't imagine it really captures much of what we're talking about here, but you have some room for creativity. So what are you going to advocate be done relative to what you're doing now?
You've thrown me here. So the data reports I'm providing are it's very basic. And I hear people talking about turnover rate being something that's not really important in the future. There'll be other more important data points. So what am I going to advocate moving forward? Well, we're in the company I work for at the moment is in financial services. It's CBUS superannuation, and we're just about to embark on implementing an HRIS, and I'm really excited about that. I'm on the project team, basically because there'll be more data for us to actually establish some insights or create some insights. And at the moment, I'm just going to be taking home to CBUS everything that I'm learning from today and tomorrow, and hopefully be able to point us in the right direction with regards to our people data.
Thank you. Paddy, what's coming up for you? I mean, you're obviously with a professional sports organization. And as I kick this off, I frankly don't know how healthy of a model it is for businesses to look at sports organizations and say, okay, there's a plus minus thing over here, and should we be looking for plus minus on, teams? I mean, what's your perspective on what you are doing, in terms of metrics and analytics, vis-a-vis what you would advise organizations to be focusing on?
Just a small question, hey?
Yeah.
For your first part, what's coming up? There's always a new draft class coming up, and so there's always more data being collected and models being adjusted. But in particular, if I'm looking at, so I described what we've discovered so far and competitiveness being the number one, but that's it really depends on the question you ask. And we asked who stood out more than anyone else. Mm-hmm. As opposed to, for the average draft pick, can we just get them to be worth 5 picks ahead or 5 picks below? And over the course of time, you'll build a great roster. And if we did that, I suspect that competitiveness would drop in importance, and probably something more healthy, because some of those names that I threw out before, if you talk about Michael Jordan or Mike Tyson, or, there are plenty of people who've been incredibly successful as athletes, but like you mentioned, they're running 80, 90 hours a week. They don't have healthy relationships. They spend all their money, and it's not a sustainable model for the general population of even just athletes, let alone the general population of human beings. Right. And so there's a constant search for ways to quantify the ability to be present, and there are some psychometric scales that do that, although I'm not a big fan of any of them yet from a validity and reliability point of view. But to find a measure or a way to quantify someone's ability to become present, and maybe even their ability to be trained into that, because it is a trainable skill. So that's one part. And then the second of how that translates to the general population. I think the same thing applies, where it's less about trying to find, hey, we're trying to find the person who can give us the maximum stock return. Obviously, that's fantastic. But that will only last as long as that person lasts in the job. And while turnover may not be important, the ability to sustain a business model over 5, 10, 15 years, or be able to have people who know it well enough to adjust it, is for me something pretty important. So a well-being based model is something that hopefully becomes more commonplace.
Yeah, thank you for that. A bit of a non sequitur, and we're going to do... I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to take some questions from you all, and then we're going to start to wrap. Paddy, actually, the question for you all. Who's doing ONA, Organizational Network Analysis, or Relationship Analytics in your organization? Okay, probably 10, give or take. So Michael Arena, who was formerly the head of talent at General Motors, who's now at Amazon, spoke at our event in San Francisco a couple years back, and he talked about the idea of personas. So how do teams and organizations get things done? There are people who generate ideas, there are people who amplify ideas, there are people who sell ideas, buy ideas. So there's these different personas. So Paddy, sticking with you for a minute, do you look at how the team will function? Because if you have 5 alphas, 10 alphas out there, to use a very sports term, it might not work. But so do you look for fit?
Yeah, it's ironic that you asked that, because as soon as I stopped talking, I was like, you blacked out. You forgot the other thing you were going to say. I've just started talking with Manchester City over the last couple of months, or a month and a bit.
David, you okay?
They're not as bad as Manchester United.
Okay.
To be Liverpool.
Yeah, they're pretty bad.
I just felt the energy. Arsenal fan.
And they are in the process of trying to, in the back blocks, while they're having this incredible success, so for anyone who doesn't follow English football or even football in general, they've won everything that they could win in the last year, and they're probably a chance to do it again. And in large part thanks to one of the personas who's at the centre of the team, and that's their head coach, who's been incredibly successful basically wherever he's gone. And they're trying to, and who knows how successful this will be, but they're trying to work out, okay, if and when he moves on, because eventually he has to, how are we going to maintain this ecosystem that he has built? It's not like it was happening before he got there. And so part of that is the human interaction component, and some network analysis, and also trying to quantify and become explicit about what it was that he does that other people didn't do before him. So it is an interesting element, and I think that's an area that may not have been explored well enough yet. It could be a competitive advantage.
Thank you, Dafna. Something to add?
Yeah, just to piggyback off that, I would say, like in sports, Phil Jackson was sort of our domestic reverend at the time. And if you think about what it was about him, it was his mindfulness and that approach. So it's sort of a full circle back to someone who really was cutting edge and was able to and when he went to other teams, and he was brought to a couple other teams specifically because they thought he could sort of recreate that energy and that communication, I think that speaks to also the difference of the types of people that you're working with. And it's not always that simple, and preserving that ecosystem, and how the evolution of sports has changed in general. And the athlete, him and herself, has completely changed and just becoming identified as an athlete to a brand. Yeah. So there's a lot of other dynamics that athletes today are after, sometimes, unfortunately, more than the goal of the team.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a wrap-up question. Does anyone have a question for our panelists before we do that? Yeah. Can David, do you mind running over to that gentleman? Do you have a mic or no?
You got another mic?
Yeah, just go ahead.
Yeah. So
I'll repeat the question.
For the gentleman on the right, with the number of statistics and data that's out there on all athletes, if you go to 538 and read Nate Silver, there's wins above replacement. There's just so many things on every single athlete. Are you starting to see anxiety from athletes around those statistics? And if so, how are you dealing with that? How are you coaching around it?
But before you go, Patty, I'm going to repeat the question. So there's a lot of data being generated by 538 just on athletes, and is it creating anxiety that they're being measured in this way?
The real short answer, yes. Real answer is it depends. Like anything, depends on the sport. I see it more in baseball than I do in basketball, because they're much more bought and sold on numbers there than they are in basketball. But there's also an element of the person in it. There are some guys who do not give a shit, and there are others who, even though their numbers are great, still worry about it. And there are always going to be elements of, even before the numbers happen, it was, does the coach like me or not? Because that's going to decide. There's always something that's going to decide whether you progress or not. And so if you're a worrier, you'll worry about it. And it so happens to be numbers at the moment. The funny thing about all that stuff is, if you compile a team based entirely on those numbers, you still don't win. And that's the, I guess, the basis for the argument of some of the people analytics stuff, and the human side, the psychometric side, the org psych side, is that if the pure performance-based numbers models, and you did them to the max, don't win all the time, then there is something else going on there. And that's where I think this community has a place to fill, both in the sports community, but more importantly in the broader community.
So, Patty, since you have the mic, just closing comments or ideas for everybody that haven't been mentioned. I don't know how long you've been here today, but it's we've been talking about a lot of different stuff, and so there's no obviously right or wrong answer. I'm just really curious on everyone's behalf here. Is okay, yeah, I want to be a key contributor, a high-performing, athlete. Is there something that maybe we should do in our lives, or advocate that our organization do? Because not everyone's going to be a high-level athlete, but systematically, if we're going to enable the organization to be more productive, to have a better culture, we have to shift many of the things that we're doing. So what would you offer up?
I appreciate you taking a couple of minutes to ask that question, because when you first said it, I was like, oh shit, I got no idea. I've been here 20 minutes, so
I had plenty of time.
so hopefully this resonates with something that was said today. The way I discovered the initial model that led me to finding competitiveness as the biggest predictor was done not by trying to prove myself right or my ideas right. So I would say the biggest thing, if you are in the analytics part of your business function, or you're trying to discover something, is to not try and prove yourself right, is to find the people who are good at what they do and try and prove their hunches right or their hunches wrong, whatever it is. Because I asked, under duress, I asked all of the coaches at the team that I was at, and it's a baseball team. They have 7 minor league teams, so there was 70 different coaches who I had to run a poll on. Is that working? Yeah. And asked them, what do you think is important? What makes a guy pop and what doesn't? And they kept saying competitiveness, and I was like, yeah, whatever. Like, I don't even know how I measure that. But because it came up so strong, we looked for it and we found something that actually did measure it, and it turns out they were all right. So that wasn't my gut feel, but it led me to one of the biggest learnings of my career. And so I encourage everyone here to not try and prove yourself right. That's not what it's about.
Yeah, no, well said. Emily, similar question. You have been here all day. So what's popping for you? What would you either recommend for others, or what you think you're going to go back and adopt? And I know you're in the process of discovering what that is, but I love what Paddy just shared, that he had the openness and willingness to learn and the creativity to actually apply something moving forward. But so what's emerging for you?
It's absolutely the same thing as Paddy was just saying, just be open-minded. I obviously don't have a preconceived idea of what I'm looking for at the moment, but it will be analysing the data and then doing a bit more of a deep dive. So just keep asking more questions and seeking the questions from the business areas, and and that's pretty much where I'll be. I don't have a data science background or anything like that. So
not yet.
Yeah, not yet. Very interested.
And Dafna?
I would say surround yourself with people who think differently than you do. I think that, when you come, it's great to be specialized and have a niche in something and be really great at it. But to find other people that you can bring into the circle to help either identify the problem, answer the question, that come from a different sort of background, you're going to get the most creative and probably long-lasting solution for the long term. And that's something that I think has sort of been a theme in a lot of different ways from what we've heard here today, and something that I've learned from my experience. I'm a product of it. I think you are too, actually. And I know from your background, just coming from sports, doing your positive psych, the three of us, we're able to sort of apply the different backgrounds that we have in a very specific way, but not necessarily because that's what we were trained in. So that's what I'd say.
All right. Well, if you would, please help me thanking the panelists. Thank you very much. Outstanding. Outstanding.